When a waitress returned a lost wallet, she expected nothing more than a thank you. Instead, she uncovered the one fragile memory that still broke the millionaire's heart. The rain had stopped only minutes before, leaving the pavement slick and shining under the dull yellow glow of the streetlights. The buses hissed as they pulled up to the curb, their doors opening to swallow tired workers who clutched bags and umbrellas. Among them moved Claire, her shoes damp, her steps quick, her mind already at the apartment waiting for her, a space she shared with two roommates where the rent always seemed heavier than her paycheck. She had just finished a long shift at the diner, her hair smelling faintly of grease and coffee, her feet aching with every step, but she kept moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering all the things she couldn't fix tonight. She almost missed it. The wallet lay half hidden near the bus stop bench, dark brown leather darkened even further by the wet concrete. For a moment it was just another shadow in a city full of them, but something in its shape made her slow down. A man in a suit stepped past it without a glance. A group of teenagers laughed as they walked by, their sneakers splashing through puddles, and still the wallet lay there, ignored, waiting. Claire hesitated. The bus she needed was already pulling up, its brakes screeching, its headlights cutting across her. She could climb aboard, go home, and forget she ever saw it. No one would know the difference. But her feet refused to move toward the bus. Instead, she found herself bending down, her fingers brushing the cool leather, lifting it from the ground. It was heavier than she expected, not stuffed with bills, but with the weight of something important. The bus doors closed with a hiss behind her, the sound of her ride disappearing into the wet night. She stood still for a moment, staring at the object in her hand, her reflection faint in the puddle below. The wallet was worn but cared for, the edges softened with time, the stitching still intact. Whoever owned it had carried it for years. She opened it carefully, expecting maybe a few credit cards, maybe an ID. What she found first was a driver's license, with a name she knew from the news: Adrian Vale, 35 years old, billionaire tech founder. She had seen his face in newspapers, on screens in the diner, even on the billboard downtown with his company's new slogan. Her breath caught. This was not just anyone's wallet. This belonged to a man whose life seemed as distant from hers as the moon. She glanced around, half expecting someone to leap out and claim it, but the crowd had thinned, leaving only her and the quiet hum of the city. For a moment, temptation whispered, she could keep it, use the cards, maybe find some cash hidden inside. No one would ever expect a waitress with holes in her shoes to be holding a millionaire's wallet. But another voice, quieter yet stronger, reminded her who she was. She slipped the wallet into her bag, not as a thief, but as someone who knew the difference between right and wrong, even when no one was watching. She started walking again, her bus gone, the night stretching ahead, her life unchanged except for the weight of the leather in her bag. Something told her that picking it up had changed more than her evening. Something told her that her life had just stepped onto a path she never could have imagined. Claire walked quickly, her bag pressed tight against her side, as if the weight of the wallet inside might draw unwanted eyes. The street was quieter now, the last buses gone, the storefronts dark except for the neon glow of the corner pharmacy. She told herself she would drop the wallet at the nearest police station in the morning, but the name she had glimpsed on the driver's license pulled at her thoughts, refusing to leave her alone. She reached a corner under the flickering light of a street lamp, and finally gave in, stopping to open the bag and take the wallet out again. Her fingers shook a little as she flipped it open, the smell of old leather rising faintly. She slid the ID card out and held it closer to the light. The name was clear, the face on the card even clearer. Adrian Vale. She whispered it aloud, as if testing how it sounded in her mouth. She had seen that name printed under bold headlines about groundbreaking technology, about fortunes made in a single year, about charity donations so large they seemed unreal. And she had seen the face too, sharper in person than the photos on magazines. The clean lines of his jaw, the dark hair always neatly in place, the eyes that carried the kind of focus most people never had. For a long moment she just stared at it, her breath fogging in the cool night air. This was not some stranger's wallet lost on a bus stop bench. This belonged to one of the richest men in the city, maybe in the country. She remembered once wiping down a booth in the diner, while the television above the counter played a news story about him. A customer had shaken his head and muttered that men like Adrian Vale never lost anything. Not money, not time, not control. Yet here she was, holding the man's wallet like it had fallen into her world by mistake. There was no cash, just a sleek black credit card that probably had no limit, a couple of business cards with embossed lettering, and that folded piece of paper tucked carefully behind the license. She resisted the urge to open it, though her curiosity pressed hard against her sense of respect. She slid the ID back into place and closed the wallet, her thumb running along the smooth edge. She thought about what it meant. If she returned it tomorrow, would she even be able to get near him? Would security laugh in her face, dismiss her as some desperate girl trying to scam her way into a meeting with a billionaire? The image of the guards at the gates of his mansion flashed through her mind, their eyes hard, their voices sharp. She imagined herself standing there with her wrinkled diner uniform and tired shoes, clutching his wallet, trying to prove she wasn't a thief. Still, there was something about the name that would not let her walk away. Adrian Vale. It felt heavy, almost like a secret. She had picked up more than a wallet tonight, she realized. She had picked up a piece of a man's life, a man the world watched but never really knew. She didn't know why, but she felt certain that this wallet, with its worn leather and single-folded note, had found its way into her hands for a reason. Claire sat on the edge of her narrow bed with the wallet resting in her lap, the quiet of the apartment pressing in around her. Her roommates were out for the evening, one working late at the hospital, the other visiting family, and the silence gave her space she was not sure she wanted. She turned the wallet over in her hands, running her fingers along the creased leather, surprised again at how plain it was. For a man like Adrian Vale, she had expected something sleek and new, the kind of wallet that matched expensive suits and gleaming cars, but this one looked softened by years. The color faded at the edges, the kind of thing you kept, not for style, but for memory. Curiosity pulled at her, stronger than she cared to admit. She thought of the headlines, the photos of him standing beside world leaders and celebrities, the numbers that trailed his name like a shadow, billions earned, millions donated, projects that reshaped entire industries. She imagined what his life must be like, and she imagined what might be inside his wallet. Stacks of bills crisp and thick, receipts from luxury stores, a glimpse into a world so far from her own that it barely seemed real. But when she opened it again, she found no stacks of cash, not even a handful of folded bills. Instead, there were only a few cards, each one sleek and official, the kind that spoke of limitless access to money without ever showing it. A black credit card, a platinum card, a membership card for a private club she had never heard of, and a pair of business cards embossed with his company's logo. The wallet was organized with almost clinical neatness, every card in its proper place, nothing extra, nothing wasted. And then there was the folded piece of paper, tucked behind the license, its edges soft from being handled too many times. It seemed almost out of place among the precise order of the rest. Claire hesitated, her thumb brushing over the crease. It looked fragile, the way paper does when it has been carried too long in the same spot, pulled out and put back so often it becomes part of the object that holds it. She wondered what could matter so much to a man who had everything, what words or picture he needed to keep close, even when surrounded by all the wealth and power anyone could dream of. For a long time she just held it, the paper warm from the touch of her hand. She wanted to unfold it, to see what was inside, but something about it felt private, almost sacred. She thought about how little she knew of him beyond what the world chose to show, how carefully guarded people like him kept their truths. She slid it back into place, her breath tight, as if even that small act of restraint mattered. Closing the wallet, she realized the strangest thing of all. For all the wealth attached to his name, for all the stories of power and influence, the wallet of Adrian Vale held almost nothing of value that the world would recognize. And yet, that single folded piece of paper felt heavier than all the missing stacks of cash combined. Claire placed the wallet on the table in front of her, the dim light from the kitchen bulb catching the worn leather in a way that made it look older than it probably was. Her apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator, a refrigerator that at that moment held little more than a carton of milk going sour and half a loaf of bread. Her rent was past due again, the envelope from the landlord waiting like an accusation on the counter. Her tips from the diner barely stretched to cover the basics, and every week she told herself she would find a way to climb out of the hole, though each week the hole only seemed to deepen. She looked at the wallet again, at the neat line of its stitching, at the folded piece of paper tucked inside, and for one moment her mind betrayed her with a thought she didn't want. What if she just kept it? No one had seen her pick it up. No one knew she had it. People lost things in the city every day, and most of them never came back. Inside were cards that could buy more than she had ever dreamed of affording, a name that could open doors she would never be invited to step through. For one small moment, the temptation pressed hard against her chest. But then she thought about the weight of those cards, the trail they would leave the moment she tried to use them, the look on the cashier's face when the name Adrian Vale flashed across a receipt, while Claire in her worn shoes tried to smile as if nothing was strange. She thought about the paper inside, folded so carefully, and how wrong it would feel to take something that clearly mattered so deeply to someone else. She wasn't a thief. Life had taken plenty from her, but she had never taken from others. Her fingers brushed over the wallet again, slower this time, almost tender. She pictured the man whose face she had seen in magazines, a man standing tall in front of cameras, his voice calm and precise when talking about the future of technology. She tried to imagine him searching for his wallet, checking his pockets, realizing it was gone. A man who had everything, but still, maybe, would feel the same small ache she felt whenever she lost something that mattered. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes for a moment. The choice was clear. Even if it cost her, she would return it. Somehow, she would find a way to get past the gates of his estate, or into the hands of someone who could put it back where it belonged. It would not change the fact that her rent was overdue, or that her fridge was nearly empty, but it would keep her soul clean. And tonight, that felt more important than anything else. She slid the wallet back into her bag, stood up, and turned off the light. Tomorrow, she would find a way to give it back. Tonight she would sleep with the knowledge that even when life pressed her hardest, she could still choose to do what was right. The next evening, the city felt colder, though the air was still heavy with the damp smell of yesterday's rain. Claire walked with her shoulders tight, and her bag pressed close to her side, the wallet inside weighing more than it should. She had replayed the decision all day at the diner, moving between tables with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. The thought of what waited in her bag whispering at her no matter how many cups of coffee she poured. By the time her shift ended and she stepped onto the bus that wound its way out of the crowded streets and into the wealthier part of town, her stomach was tight with nerves. When she stepped off the bus and began walking the final stretch, she realized she had never been in this neighborhood before. The sidewalks were lined with trimmed hedges. The street lamps cast steady pools of golden light, and the houses stood farther apart, each one more grand than the last. Her worn shoes felt out of place against the clean pavement, and she pulled her jacket tighter as if to hide the simple uniform beneath it. She kept her eyes fixed ahead, not on the shining cars that passed, or the tall gates she knew she was nearing. And then she saw it. The estate stretched wide, its iron gates tall and black, curling into ornate patterns that seemed to whisper money and power. Beyond them she could see the drive curving through trees, toward a house so large it looked more like a hotel than a home. Lights glowed warmly in tall windows, but to Claire they felt distant, unreachable. Her breath caught as she stood in front of the gates, her hand trembling as she reached into her bag and felt the familiar leather of the wallet. Almost at once, movement drew her attention. A man in a dark uniform stepped out of the small guardhouse near the gate. He was tall, broad, shouldered, his expression unreadable as his eyes swept over her, lingering on her tired clothes, her scuffed shoes, the way she clutched the bag to her chest. Another guard joined him, his gaze sharp, the two of them exchanging a glance that said they already suspected she did not belong here. "Can I help you?" the first one asked, his voice calm but edged with suspicion. Claire's mouth went dry. She thought of turning around, of fleeing back to the bus stop, but then she felt the wallet again in her hands and forced herself to stand straighter. "I found this," she said, her voice quieter than she meant it to be. "It belongs to Adrian Vale." The second guard stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as if he expected her to produce something forged, some trick. She opened the wallet and held it out, the ID card with the familiar face visible under the gate's light. The first guard took it carefully, flipping through with a practiced eye. "Wait here," he said, disappearing back into the guardhouse with the wallet. Claire stood frozen, her heart pounding as the second guard kept watch, his expression giving nothing away. She felt small before the towering gates, smaller still under the weight of the guard's stare, but she forced herself not to look down. Minutes stretched long, each one louder than the last in her chest, until finally the first guard returned. "You'd better come inside," he said. The gates began to swing open, slow and heavy, and Claire realized with a mix of dread and disbelief that in just a moment she would be stepping into a world she had only ever seen from far away. The long driveway curved through a canopy of trees, before opening to a house that seemed to glow against the evening sky. Claire followed the guard's silent lead, her shoes clicking softly on the smooth stone, her heart racing with every step closer to the entrance. The mansion was larger than anything she had ever seen, its windows tall and bright, its doors carved from dark wood that looked heavy enough to withstand a storm. She had imagined handing the wallet to a butler, maybe a personal assistant, who would take it with a polite smile and send her away. That was what she expected, and in truth what she hoped for, because the thought of facing the man himself filled her with a nervous energy she couldn't quiet. The guard stopped at the door, spoke quietly into a small device on his shoulder, and then nodded for her to wait. He pushed the heavy door open and stepped aside. Claire drew in a shaky breath, clutching the strap of her bag. And then, to her surprise, it wasn't a servant or another guard who appeared. It was Adrian Vale. He stood in the doorway with his tie loosened, the collar of his white shirt open, his dark hair slightly disheveled, as if he had run his hands through it too many times that day. His eyes were tired, sharp but weighed down, with a kind of fatigue that no amount of money could soften. For a moment he didn't speak, only studied her with a cautious expression, as if trying to place who she was and why she stood at his door at dusk. Claire swallowed and held out the wallet with both hands. "I think this belongs to you," she said, her voice steady though her knees felt weak. Adrian's gaze dropped to the wallet, and in an instant the weariness in his posture shifted. He stepped forward quickly, almost urgently, and took it from her hands. His thumb brushed the leather as if confirming it was real. He opened it with practiced ease, checking each card, each slot, and then froze when his eyes fell on the folded piece of paper. A shadow crossed his face, and for a moment he seemed to forget she was even there. Claire waited, unsure if she should say more, unsure if she should turn and leave now that her task was done. But then he looked up, and for the first time she saw not the man from the news or the photographs, but someone startled by the sudden return of something personal. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice lower than she expected, carrying a weight that felt more personal than demanding. "Near the bus stop," she answered. It was just lying there. I thought someone might take it if I didn't. So, I brought it back." Silence stretched between them. His eyes searched her face, not unkindly, but with a depth that made her want to look away. Finally, he gave the smallest nod, a gesture of acknowledgement that carried more gratitude than words. "Thank you," he said simply, though the way he said it made her feel the words were heavier than they seemed. Standing in the doorway of his home, with the world's noise shut out behind those great doors, Claire realized she had stepped into something unexpected, a moment that felt like the beginning of a story she had not planned to be part of. Adrian stood just inside the doorway, the wallet open in his hands, the light from the chandelier above casting a soft glow across his face. Claire remained where she was, unsure whether to step further into the house or retreat back down the long driveway. She watched him with a kind of quiet curiosity, surprised by how different he seemed in person compared to the photographs she had seen on screens and in newspapers. The man who looked so untouchable in public now looked almost vulnerable, his fingers moving carefully over each card, as if confirming nothing had been disturbed. He checked the license, the black credit card, the business cards. Each one returned to its place with mechanical precision. Then his thumb paused against the last slot, where the folded piece of paper rested. Claire noticed the way his breath caught, the way his shoulders stiffened, as though an invisible hand had gripped him. He slid the paper out slowly, holding it as if it were more fragile than glass. His eyes narrowed slightly, his lips pressing together, and for the first time since she had handed him the wallet, he seemed to forget she was there. He unfolded the paper with deliberate care, and though she told herself not to look, Claire could not stop her eyes from catching a glimpse. The paper was old, its edges worn from years of being handled. The colors were faint now, but they were unmistakable, lines of crayon pressed in the kind of uneven strokes that only a child could make. Adrian stared at it, his face unreadable at first, then softening in a way that startled her. His eyes glistened as he traced a finger along the uneven letters, words written in the bright colors of a child's hand. She could not read them from where she stood, but she saw how deeply they mattered. For a long moment he didn't move, the grand house behind him silent, the guards outside far away, the city even farther. It was only him and that piece of paper, and Claire could almost feel the weight of his memory filling the space. Finally, he drew in a breath and folded the note again, his hands trembling just slightly. He slid it back into the wallet with the same care someone might give a treasure. Only then did he look up at her, and his eyes were different, less guarded, more human. "You didn't touch this?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. "No," Claire said quickly, shaking her head. "I saw it was there, but I didn't look." He studied her face as though searching for any hint of a lie, then nodded slowly. His gaze softened again, though his mouth remained set in a firm line. "This," he said quietly, patting the wallet with his hand, "is the only thing I can't replace." Claire didn't ask why. She didn't need to. The way his voice broke slightly at the edges told her that the folded paper carried a story heavier than money, heavier than any of the wealth people attached to his name. She simply nodded, and for the first time since arriving at the mansion gates, she felt he was truly speaking to her, not as a stranger, not as a billionaire, but as a man holding something fragile that reminded him of what he had lost. Adrian held the folded paper in both hands, as if afraid it might crumble into dust if he loosened his grip. The house around him seemed to fade, the tall ceilings, the polished floors, the heavy doors, all of it forgotten as his eyes moved over the childish strokes of color. The drawing was simple, uneven lines of blue sky and yellow sun, a crooked little house with flowers leaning against it, and in the middle a figure with arms stretched wide, smiling in a way only children think to draw. Above it, written in shaky crayon letters, were the words that had once made him laugh and now made his chest tighten until he could barely breathe. "Don't forget to smile, big brother." Claire stayed quiet by the door, watching him without speaking. sensing that she was standing on the edge of a memory that belonged to him alone. She saw the way his mouth trembled, the way his shoulders lowered as if carrying a weight that no amount of money or success could ease. She had not expected this, had not expected that the paper inside the wallet would be something so deeply personal, so far from the glittering world that carried his name. Adrian closed his eyes, and for a moment he was not the man she had seen in newspapers or on television, not the billionaire whose ideas shaped companies and industries, but a boy again, a brother remembering a sister's voice. The image of her came back so sharply he almost staggered under it. Her laugh, high and clear, the way she would tug on his sleeve when he was too serious, the way she had insisted on drawing him pictures for his desk even when he told her he was too busy to look. She had been 12 the day the car spun off the wet road, 12 the day his world cracked apart. He had been away at college, too wrapped in exams and projects to call her back the night before, and that guilt had followed him into every deal, every headline, every sleepless night since. He opened his eyes again and stared at the words, faded but still visible, written with a purple crayon pressed so hard into the paper that the marks had left grooves. Don't forget to smile. She had known even then what he did not, that life was more than work, more than ambition, more than the relentless climb. She had left him with a reminder, one that he had carried every day since, tucked in his wallet like a heartbeat he could not lose. The tears came before he could stop them. One slipped down his cheek, and then another, until he bowed his head, his hands trembling around the paper. It was not the kind of grief that shouted, but the quiet kind that sits heavy and deep, breaking through the cracks at unexpected moments. Claire felt her own throat tighten as she watched him, realizing that the richest man she had ever heard of was standing before her, undone by a child's drawing. He folded the paper carefully again, slid it back into the wallet, and pressed the wallet against his chest as if to steady himself. When he finally looked at her, his eyes were red but clear, and his voice was raw when he spoke. "This," he said, almost to himself, "is all I have left of her." Claire nodded softly, not needing to say anything more. For the first time, she saw him not as a figure from the news, but as a man broken by loss, holding on to a message written in crayon that still had the power to undo him completely. The silence in the great hallway stretched so long that Claire began to wonder if she should quietly step back through the open door and disappear into the night. But she couldn't move, not when she saw the way Adrian stood there with the folded paper pressed to his chest, his shoulders shaking ever so slightly. She had seen him only from a distance before, on screens and in glossy photos, always with that same steady gaze and that same expression that gave nothing away. Now, the mask was gone. His breath caught in his throat, and tears slipped free before he could stop them, rolling down his face in a way that was raw and unguarded. He didn't try to turn away, didn't try to hide it behind the polished manner the world expected of him. Instead, he let it happen, his eyes closing as if to surrender to the ache he had carried alone for too long. Claire felt the strangeness of the moment pressing against her, the way two worlds had collided by accident, her world of overdue rent and empty cupboards, and his world of billion-dollar companies and cameras. Yet in this moment, neither world mattered. He was simply a man undone by a memory, and she was simply a witness to it. Adrian drew a shuddering breath and opened his eyes again, the tears still bright on his cheeks. For a second he seemed embarrassed, as though realizing how exposed he was, but the feeling passed quickly. Perhaps even he knew there was no use pretending with her, this stranger who had returned something most people would have never bothered to give back. He slipped the wallet into his pocket, but the weight of it seemed different now, heavier for having been lost and found again. "I don't do this," he said quietly, his voice rough from the effort of holding himself steady. "Not in front of anyone, not in years." Claire nodded without speaking, her own throat too tight to answer. She understood, without needing the details, understood the kind of grief that waits beneath the surface and shows itself when you least expect it. He studied her for a moment, his eyes searching as if to measure the kind of person she was. Most people would have kept walking, he said, or they would have taken what they could and thrown the rest away. I thought about it, she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. But it didn't feel right. His lips curved into the faintest smile. A broken thing, but real. You don't know what you've given back to me, he said. Claire shifted on her feet, uncomfortable with the weight of his gratitude. It was your wallet. It wasn't mine to keep. He gave a small nod, then glanced away, wiping at his face with the back of his hand. The tears were gone now, but the truth of them lingered in the set of his features, in the way the careful distance he wore had cracked. For once, he wasn't the unreachable man on the cover of magazines. He was just a brother who had lost his sister, and a man who had been reminded of how fragile memory can be. And standing in his doorway, Claire realized that sometimes even the strongest walls fall when touched by something small enough to fit inside a wallet, written in the uneven strokes of a crayon. Claire stood in the doorway with her hands pressed lightly against the strap of her bag, the weight of the evening sinking into her bones. She had not expected this. She had not expected the man from the headlines, the billionaire who seemed untouchable, to be standing in front of her with tears streaking his face, his voice raw from memories he could not hold back. She had thought she would hand over the wallet, hear a polite thank you from a stranger who lived in another world, and leave without being noticed again. Instead, she found herself in the middle of a moment so private, it felt almost wrong to witness. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. What could she possibly say? That she was sorry? That she understood? None of it would be enough, and none of it belonged to her to offer. So she said nothing. She stayed very still, her silence filling the space between them in a way that felt respectful rather than empty. Adrian glanced at her once, his eyes red but steady now, and she knew he could see that she wasn't going to press him with questions or pity. He gave the smallest nod, almost a gesture of relief, as if he was grateful she hadn't tried to fill the air with the wrong kind of words. He tucked the wallet safely back into his pocket, but his hand lingered there, as though he needed to keep it close, to reassure himself that the drawing was still safe. Claire let her gaze drop to the floor, to the polished wood that gleamed under the light. She tried to steady her own breathing, tried to ignore the thrum of her heart that seemed to echo in the vast hallway. She thought about her own life, the losses she never spoke of, the small pains she carried quietly, because speaking them out loud never seemed to make them lighter. Perhaps, she thought, grief was something that always asked for silence. The quiet stretched on, but it was not uncomfortable. It was a silence that felt earned, as though words would only cheapen the weight of what had just passed. She shifted slightly, wondering if she should excuse herself, but Adrian's voice broke through before she could step back. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured, almost as though he could read her thoughts. She lifted her head and met his gaze, and for the first time she saw no distance there, no wall of wealth or power, only the simple truth of a man who had been cracked open by memory. She nodded once, her silence still intact, and he seemed to accept it as the answer he needed. In that moment, Claire understood something she had never realized before. Sometimes, the greatest gift you could give someone wasn't advice or comfort, but the space to feel what they needed to feel without interruption. And so she stood quietly, the stranger at his door, bearing witness to a grief too deep for words, and in her stillness, she gave him the room to breathe again. Adrian stood quietly for a moment, after slipping the wallet back into his pocket, his hand still resting against it, as if to hold the memory close. The silence between them had softened, not heavy anymore, but delicate, the way silence feels after something honest has been shared. Claire shifted her weight, thinking the moment had ended, that it was time to thank him for opening the door and excuse herself. She had done what she came to do, returned the wallet, and she was ready to slip back into her world where no one noticed her comings and going. But then Adrian surprised her. His voice was low, gentler than before. "Would you stay a little longer?" he asked. Just for tea. The words caught her off guard. She blinked, her mouth opening slightly but no answer forming. She had expected a brief exchange, maybe gratitude, but not an invitation into the kind of home she had only ever seen from the outside. She hesitated, glancing back toward the dark driveway, the tall gates that seemed to promise safety and distance from the world she knew. "I don't want to intrude," she said softly. "You're not intruding," he replied, his eyes steady on hers. "You brought something back to me I thought was gone. I'd like you to sit for a moment. Nothing more." She hesitated again, the instinct to retreat warring with the strange sense that what he offered wasn't charity, wasn't about wealth or showing off, but something simpler. His grief had been so visible, so human, that it felt wrong to walk away without acknowledging it. She nodded finally, just once, and followed as he stepped back into the house and led her toward a wide sitting room filled with warm light and shelves of books. The room smelled faintly of cedar and tea leaves. Adrian moved with quiet efficiency, setting a kettle on a tray, his hands steady now as though the ritual of preparing something ordinary anchored him. Claire sat on the edge of a sofa, upholstered in a fabric so soft it almost seemed out of place for her. She ran her fingers along the seam of her jacket, unsure of what to do with herself. When he returned with 2 cups, he handed one to her with surprising care, as though she were someone important, not just a waitress in shoes that had seen too many miles. She wrapped her hands around the warmth of the porcelain, grateful for something to hold. Neither of them spoke for a few minutes. The only sound was the faint ticking of a clock and the quiet hum of the kettle cooling on the tray. Finally, Adrian leaned back, his gaze not on her, but on the fire flickering in the hearth. "I don't often let people in," he said, almost as if to himself, "but tonight it feels right." Claire sipped her tea and said nothing. She didn't need to. His grief was genuine, his invitation honest, and for the first time, she saw not the billionaire the world admired, but a man reaching for something as simple as company. The tea had gone lukewarm in Claire's hands, but she kept holding the cup anyway, grateful for the weight of it, grateful for something to keep her steady. The fire cracked softly in the hearth, throwing light across the room that made the shadows dance along the tall shelves. Adrian sat across from her, his posture not quite as rigid as when he had first opened the door, but still carrying the kind of control that comes from years of keeping everything locked inside. For a long time he didn't speak, and Claire began to think that perhaps he had invited her to sit only so he wouldn't feel the silence pressing against him alone. Then his gaze dropped to the wallet resting on the table between them, and his voice broke the stillness. "She was 12, he said quietly, the words so sudden Claire almost thought she had misheard him. He didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the fire. "My sister. Her name was Emily. She drew that picture for me the week before the accident." Claire's throat tightened, but she stayed quiet, sensing that if she interrupted he might stop. "I was at college," he continued, his voice low but steady now, as though each word was pulled from somewhere deep inside. "I was studying, working 2 jobs, already thinking about building something of my own. She called me the night before the crash, left a message on my phone. I didn't answer because I thought I was too busy. I told myself I'd call her back later. But later never came." His fingers flexed against his knee, as though trying to hold on to something that kept slipping away. "My parents survived, but she didn't, and I carried that note with me ever since. I folded it, put it in my wallet, and made sure it never left my side. Everything I built after that, all the late nights, all the companies, all the money, I told myself I was doing it to honor her, to make sure her voice didn't fade." He paused, his jaw tightening, his eyes shining again. "But really, I think I was just running from how much it hurt." The fire snapped, the sound filling the space where neither of them spoke. Claire felt her chest ache at the image of a 12-year-old girl, leaving behind a crayon drawing, the kind of gift a brother might tuck away without realizing it would one day become his only link to her. She thought of his name in headlines, always attached to numbers and power, And how none of that had anything to do with the boy who once missed a call and never forgave himself for it. Adrian finally looked at her, his voice lower now, raw. Everyone sees the empire, the money, the success. They think I built it because I was ambitious, because I wanted more than anyone else. But the truth is, I built it because it was the only way I knew to survive the grief. I worked until I forgot how to feel. Except for this. He nodded toward the wallet. That little note reminded me. There was once someone who believed I could be more than what I turned into. Claire's eyes stung, but she stayed silent, letting him speak, letting him finally place the weight of his truth somewhere outside of himself. In that moment, she understood that returning the wallet hadn't just given him back a possession, it had given him permission to remember, and perhaps even to begin forgiving himself. The firelight painted the room in soft gold, but Claire felt the weight of his story still pressing against her chest. She hadn't expected to hear something so raw, hadn't expected to see a man the whole world envied lay his grief so bare in front of her. For a long moment she kept quiet, her hands resting on the cooling cup, her eyes on the wallet that seemed to carry more than money ever could. She could have stayed silent, could have nodded and excused herself and let his confession hang in the air unanswered. But something about the way he looked at her, steady and unguarded, made her want to speak. "I almost didn't pick it up," she said, her voice low, careful, as though testing whether she was allowed to add her story to his. "The wallet. I saw it on the ground by the bus stop, and I thought about walking past it. It would have been easier. I had just finished a long shift, my feet were aching, and my bus was pulling up. But something made me stop." Adrian's gaze stayed on her, not with the polished interest of a businessman, but with the quiet focus of someone who actually wanted to hear the answer. She let out a slow breath. "I work at a diner on the other side of the city. It's nothing fancy, just one of those places that smells like coffee no matter what you order. I work double shifts most weeks. Sometimes triple if someone calls in sick. The tips pay for groceries when they're good, but they're not always good. My rent was due 2 weeks ago. I still don't have all of it. The fridge in my apartment is half empty most of the time, and I've gotten used to pretending I'm not hungry when I send money to my mom instead. She's sick, and the medicine isn't cheap." Her throat tightened, but she pushed on, the words tumbling out now. "When I picked up your wallet, I thought maybe for once life had given me a break. I thought maybe it would be full of cash, maybe enough to buy a week of breathing space. But when I opened it, there were only cards and that piece of paper. And even though I could have tried to use the cards, I couldn't do it. It didn't feel right. It didn't feel like mine." She glanced at him, expecting to see pity in his eyes, the kind she hated, but what she saw instead was understanding. That surprised her more than anything. "I almost kept walking," she admitted again, her voice smaller now. "I was so tired, and I kept thinking no one would ever know. But I knew, and I couldn't carry that kind of weight. So I came here, even though it scared me." The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was softer, as if her words had settled into the same place where his grief lived. She looked down at her hands, embarrassed by how much she had revealed. But when she lifted her eyes again, she found his fixed on her, steady and sincere, as if her story mattered as much as his own. The fire had burned lower, the flames smaller now, but neither of them moved to add another log. The quiet felt like something they both needed, a space carved out of the night where truths could sit without judgment. Adrian leaned back in his chair, his eyes still touched with the red of tears, though his posture had settled into something calmer. Claire sat opposite him, her cup empty on the table, her hands folded in her lap. They had told each other more in the last half hour than they had told most people in years, and the strangeness of it sat between them like a fragile bridge. Adrian broke the silence first. "It's odd, isn't it? You and I could not live more different lives. And yet," his voice trailed off, his gaze steady on the fire. Claire tilted her head slightly, waiting, though she thought she already knew what he meant. "And yet loss finds us both the same way. he finished. It doesn't care about the size of your house or the number in your bank account. It cuts just as deep. She nodded slowly. I guess that's true. I lost my father when I was 16. He had been sick for years, but it didn't make it easier when he finally went. My mom's been sick ever since, and sometimes it feels like I've been carrying both of them ever since. I keep working because if I stop, everything falls apart. Adrian turned his head toward her, really looking at her now. So you work yourself numb to keep going, he said. That sounds familiar. Claire gave a small laugh, soft and tired. Except in my case, it's coffee pots and greasy plates, not boardrooms and billion-dollar contracts. His lips curved faintly, not quite a smile, but something close. But the reason is the same. You bury yourself in work so you don't have to feel the weight of what's missing. She looked down at her hands, the words striking deeper than she expected. Maybe, she admitted. The kinship was unexpected, yet undeniable. She had always thought people like him belonged to another world entirely, a world immune to the daily grind, immune to grief. But sitting here, seeing his pain laid bare, she realized wealth didn't shield anyone from loss. His was wrapped in privilege and silence, hers in scarcity and exhaustion. But at the core they were the same. Two people trying to carry wounds that refused to heal. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Adrian leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, his voice lower, softer. You returned this wallet when you could have walked away. You gave me back the one thing I couldn't replace. I don't think that was an accident. Claire met his gaze, feeling the strange weight of his words. She had no answer, not one that would make sense, but she felt it too. That whatever had led her to stop at that bus stop, whatever had made her pick up that wallet, had been more than chance. Two strangers, bound not by wealth or poverty, but by the simple truth that loss had shaped them both, and that somehow, tonight, their paths had been meant to cross. The night had grown deeper, outside the tall windows, the glow of the city a faint shimmer in the distance. Inside the sitting room the fire burned low, its warmth settling around them in quiet waves. Claire sat back against the sofa, aware of the strangeness of her being here, in this room with him, their lives so far apart, yet bound together by the accident of a lost wallet. She thought it was time to leave, to thank him and slip back into the night before the weight of the moment grew too heavy. But Adrian was studying her with a focus that made it clear he wasn't done. You've given me something I can't repay, he said at last, his voice steady but softened by sincerity. And I don't mean just the wallet. You reminded me that honesty still exists, that kindness can come from someone who has no reason to give it. She shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. It wasn't anything big. I just returned what wasn't mine. His eyes held hers, unblinking. No, it was more than that. You could have kept walking. You could have made a different choice, and no one would have blamed you. But you didn't. And in a world where people measure everything by what they can gain, that choice matters. Claire felt her face warm, not with pride but with embarrassment. She was not used to being seen this way, not used to her small actions being spoken of as if they held weight. I didn't do it for a reward, she said quietly. I know, Adrian replied. That's exactly why I want to help you. Her eyes widened slightly. The word help felt dangerous, like a trap wrapped in kindness. She straightened in her seat, her voice firmer now. I don't need charity. I can handle my own life. A shadow of a smile crossed his face, not mocking but understanding. I'm not offering charity. I don't believe in handouts. What I'm offering is opportunity. You've shown me more integrity tonight than most of the people I deal with every day. That matters. And I don't want it to end here at my front door. Claire's hands tightened in her lap. She wanted to believe him, but years of scraping by had taught her that help often came with strings, that offers usually carried debts she could never repay. Why me? She asked softly. Because you reminded me of something I had almost forgotten, he said. That people are still capable of doing the right thing even when no one is watching. I spend my days surrounded by people who want something from me, who smile and shake my hand while calculating what they can take. And then there's you. You had every reason not to come here tonight, but you did. That kind of honesty deserves more than a thank you." The fire crackled, and the air between them grew heavy with the weight of his words. Claire looked at him, saw the sincerity etched into his tired face, and for the first time she began to believe he wasn't speaking as a billionaire to someone beneath him. He was speaking as a man who had been reminded of the simple power of kindness, and who wanted to hold on to it before it slipped away again. Claire's first instinct was to shake her head. The offer sounded kind, even generous, but she knew enough about the way the world worked to hear the echo of danger in it. She had seen stories on the diner's television, men with too much money parading their generosity, turning real people into headlines about good deeds. She had watched customers leave $20 tips with a flourish, then talk loudly about how noble they were, as if the kindness mattered less than the performance. She didn't want to be that story. The waitress who returned a wallet and was rewarded like a charity case. Her voice came out sharper than she meant, but she couldn't hold it back. "I don't need to be saved, Mr. Vale. I just need to live my life. You don't owe me anything." Adrian didn't flinch at her words, though his gaze sharpened, not with anger, but with patience. "I'm not trying to save you," he said. "I know you can take care of yourself. You already have. What I'm offering isn't about what I owe. It's about what I see in you." She shook her head again, pressing her palms against her knees as if to ground herself. That's what everyone says at first. Then the story ends up being about them, about what they gave, about how generous they were. Meanwhile, the person on the other side is left to smile and say thank you and pretend it doesn't feel like being put on display. 6-4. The fire crackled between them, throwing shadows across the room, the warmth of it clashing with the cold edge in her chest. She thought about her rent envelope on the counter, the empty fridge, the ache in her feet from endless shifts, and still the word no trembled on her lips. She had lived her life on her own terms, even if those terms were hard, and she wasn't ready to hand her pride over, not even to a man who seemed genuine in his grief. Adrian leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his voice lower now. "I understand why you don't trust me. People with money rarely do anything without expecting something in return. But that's not what this is. I don't need a photo of us for the newspapers. I don't need a story that makes me look good. I just need to know that someone like you, someone who chose honesty when no one was watching, is given a chance to use that strength somewhere it matters." Claire stared at him, searching for the hidden angle, the part where it turned into another transaction. But his face carried no trace of calculation, only the weariness of a man who had seen too much falsehood and had finally been reminded that something real still existed. Her heart tugged against her resistance, but she held on to the silence, unwilling to yield too quickly. She had to be certain. She had to know that if she accepted anything from him, it would not erase who she was. The fire had burned down to embers, but neither of them moved to leave the sitting room. Claire's refusal still hung in the air, her words sharp but honest, and she wondered if she had gone too far, if she had spoken with too much pride in the house of a man who could change her life with a single phone call. Adrian hadn't pushed back, though. He had only listened, and now he leaned forward with his hands loosely clasped, as though weighing something important. "I won't offer you money," he said finally, his voice calm and steady. "I know what that would feel like. And you're right, it would turn this into a transaction. But there is something else I can offer, something that has nothing to do with charity and everything to do with who you are." Claire hesitated, wary but curious. "What do you mean?" He leaned back, his eyes thoughtful. "I run several community programs through my foundation. Shelters, tutoring centers, after-school programs. Most of them were created with good intentions. But intentions aren't enough. They need people who understand struggle, people who see others not as numbers, but as human beings. I can hire anyone with a polished resume, but what I need are people like you. Her breath caught, and for a moment, she wasn't sure if she had heard him right. People like me? She repeated. Yes, he said firmly. You work hard because you have to, but you didn't let exhaustion stop you from doing the right thing. You've lived what most of those programs are built to address. You know what it means to choose honesty, even when no one notices. That kind of strength and compassion is what matters most. Claire looked down at her hands, torn between disbelief and the small flicker of hope rising inside her. A permanent position, not as a token of his wealth, not as a headline for his company, but as something she could do with dignity, something where her choices and her heart mattered. She thought about the endless shifts at the diner, the way her body ached after hours of carrying trays, the way her spirit shrank each time she counted her tips and realized they still weren't enough. Her voice was careful, almost afraid. And if I say yes, what happens then? Adrian's expression softened, though his tone stayed firm. Then you won't have to fight every month just to keep a roof over your head. You'll have a role that matters, not because I handed it to you, but because you earned it the moment you returned that wallet. You reminded me that honesty still exists. I want you to help remind others too. The room was quiet again, but this time it felt lighter, as though a door had opened between them. Claire blinked back the sting in her eyes, realizing that this wasn't about saving her or turning her into another story to polish his image. This was about seeing her, really seeing her, and offering her a place where she could belong. The gates that had once felt so cold and unwelcoming now opened slowly, not with suspicion, but with recognition. Claire walked through them, with her head held a little higher, her steps steady, the late afternoon sun catching the edges of her hair. Weeks had passed since that night when she had stood trembling on the other side, clutching a wallet she almost didn't pick up. Now she carried no fear, only the quiet certainty that she belonged here, not as a stranger returning what was lost, but as someone stepping into a role that mattered. The drive stretched out before her, winding between trees whose leaves whispered in the breeze. She remembered how nervous she had been the first time, how her shoes had felt too small for the wide stone path, how the weight of the mansion had pressed against her chest. Today it was different. Today the weight she carried was not fear, but purpose. When she reached the door, she didn't wait for the guard to question her, or for Adrian to appear by accident. She pushed the bell and heard the sound echo through the great house. A moment later the door opened, and this time the man who stood there was not weary and suspicious, but calm, almost relieved. Adrian's expression softened as he saw her, the faintest smile tugging at his mouth. "Welcome back," he said simply, and the words warmed her more than she expected. Inside, the house felt less like a monument and more like a place where life was happening. There were signs of change, folders stacked on the table marked with the names of community programs, notes written in her handwriting beside his, plans sketched out for projects they would oversee together. Adrian led her into his office, a space that once seemed heavy with silence, but now carried a different kind of weight. On his desk, in a place of honor beside the computer screens and stacks of documents, sat the wallet. It was closed, resting neatly, but she knew what was inside. The folded piece of paper was still there, the drawing his sister had made all those years ago. It was no longer just a reminder of loss, though. It had become something more, proof that grief could transform into purpose when touched by honesty. Claire paused by the desk, her gaze on the wallet. "You still keep it here," she said softly. "I always will," Adrian answered. "It reminds me of her, but now it reminds me of you too. That one choice can change everything." She nodded, her throat tight with the truth of it. She thought back to the night she almost walked past it, to the bus pulling away, to the moment she chose to bend down and lift it from the wet pavement. That single decision had led her here, into a life she had never imagined, a life where her strength and compassion could shape something bigger than herself. Together they sat at the desk, going over the plans for the foundation, their voices low but filled with energy. the house no longer felt like a fortress of wealth. It felt like the starting place of something meaningful. And as the evening light poured through the windows, Claire knew this was not just Adrian's new beginning, but hers as well. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.